Well, I guess that means we're ready to go. All right. A good evening to everyone. I'm Steve Benjamin, Mayor of the great city of Columbia, and it's my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to our very first session as we start this virtual series exploring the book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. As we will discover throughout this series that will lead us well into the first quarter of next year, The Color of Law recovers a forgotten history of how federal, state, and local policy explicitly segregated metropolitan areas all across this entire nation, creating racially homogenous communities, neighborhoods and patterns that obviously violated the Constitution and will require remediation by thoughtful policymakers. It's important, obviously, even more important in the time in which we live right now, as we deal with some of the greatest pandemic since 1918, the greatest economic challenges, certainly in an election year since the Great Depression, and these incredibly challenging discussions we're having as a community around social unrest, unlike anything we've probably had since 1968. It serves as proof that the future is indeed subjective. It is what we make it. And this presents a really a fantastic opportunity over the next several months to really dig deep and think about what we can do as policymakers and leaders all across this community to try and remediate some of the challenges from generations past. So before we start this evening, I'd love to take an opportunity to thank our Columbia City Councilwoman at large, who is draped in the beautiful dress. It looks like our city flag, which speaks to the heart of inclusion that dominates policymaking in this city today. Tamika Isaac Devine, thank her for her tireless leadership of this effort in making this series possible. And so now we have so much more revealing information, some wonderful dialogue to uncover and to discuss. So it's my pleasure to hand the microphone over to my friend and our city councilwoman, Tamika Isaac Devine. Councilwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, so much. And thank you, all of you, for joining us for this very important discussion. It has been my honor to work with Mayor Benjamin and the other members of Columbia City Council to really think about what role we all play as the policymakers here in the city, the current guardians of our future, to make sure that we are not only creating an amazing city where people can prosper, but we are also making sure that it is an equitable city where everyone has endless opportunities and possibilities. And so it is my honor to be here and to think about the role that we all play in making Columbia the greatest city in the country and in the world, and making sure that we are being true to where we are in the present, but understanding our history as we move forward to create a more equitable city for the citizens of Columbia. So the purpose of this discussion will be really to explore the concepts, as the mayor stated, that are presented in the book, The Color of Law, but also understand the role that government has played in creating the city that we currently live in, and then collectively figure out what is the present and the future for Columbia for all of us. It is funny because as I was talking to folks about this conversation and the book, this book is not an opportunity, or is not meant, this discussion is not meant for us to sit here and say, and be mad at the city or really get angry about our past, but to honestly and courageously confront our past and understand what those things that this city, this county, this state, and this nation did to create the Columbia that we live in and love now, but also recognize that there are opportunities for all of us to be part of creating a collective and inclusive city where we all can prosper. And so this discussion is meant to be thought-provoking, it's meant to be intriguing, but it's also meant to provide us a framework for discussion as we move forward. The mayor has already started a very engaging conversation here in the city that we talk about inclusion and equity. And so after this series is not meant at all to be a one and done or the end of the discussion, but is merely a kickoff to a discussion that we'll all be a part of to talk about our city as we grow. So it is my honor to introduce our moderator for the evening, someone that I've known for many, many years, and I think cannot think of a better person to be part of this evening and to kick us off in moderating, and that is the Reverend Warren Bolton. Warren is a native of Columbia, and he grew up in Edisto Court community and is the youngest of 11 children. He attended the Perrin Thomas School in the Taylor's neighborhood and graduated from AC Flora High School and then the University of South Carolina. While attending USC, Warren worked for the Columbia Housing Authority, and in 1986, he began working as a reporter for the Columbia Record. Later, he served as an associate editor of the state newspaper's editorial board, where he wrote columns mostly about local government and politics, along with race and social justice. Warren has received various South Carolina Press Association awards, including being named Editorial Writer of the Year and Columnist of the Year. He was selected as one of 12 honorees to be included in the 2010 AT&T South Carolina African American History Calendar, and currently he serves as pastor of the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Camden and a communications liaison at the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. So it's my honor to thank Warren for being part of this conversation and welcome him. Thank you so much, Mr. Bolton, and I will kick it over to you right now.
Thank you, Councilwoman Devine, and thank you also, Mr. Mayor. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. And as Councilwoman Devine said, I'm Warren Bolton, Edisto Court, born and bred, just minutes from downtown Columbia. And it's a pleasure to be with you this evening. And just want to thank you for joining us. And thanks to all the partners who have worked so hard to pull this exciting series together for us. Over the past 60 years, so much of the landscape of downtown Columbia has changed, often at the expense of historic communities that were adversely impacted by redlining, urban renewal, redevelopment, and federal programs. We're here this evening to hear from people who experienced these policies firsthand, as well as people who have challenged and examined the consequences of these policies in their work. Although tonight's conversation focuses on a selected group of Columbia communities that were dramatically impacted, we're mindful that there are many more histories and communities that require further documentation and investigation. The goal of tonight's conversation and the ongoing series is to spark much needed dialogue. So we want to hear more stories, and we encourage you to share your recollections. As our panelists speak this evening, we welcome your questions. And you can direct your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll have someone monitoring the Q&A box, and they'll relay those questions at the conclusion of our conversation. Our panelists this evening include Franchot Brown, Reverend Joseph Darby, Stuart Andrews, and Rebecca Liebson. Attorney Franchot A. Brown was born in Columbia. His family resided in Alameda Court, Waverly, and Lincoln Park. He graduated from Booker T. Washington High School and obtained a Bachelor of Arts degree from Howard University and his Juris Doctorate from the University of South Carolina. Mr. Brown has been deeply involved in civic, political, and social life here in the Midlands and across South Carolina. His activities in the fields of social justice and civic engagement include serving as the founding president of the Columbia NAACP Youth Council, running a summer voter registration drive to register Black citizens, and organizing the Citizens for Fair Housing, which led to the integration of apartments and neighborhoods in Richland County, and also the integration of the YMCA system in the city of Columbia. In 1969, he served as president of the Neighborhood Protective Association, which strongly opposed the routes that were selected for the Northeastern Freeway, today known as I-277. He's worked as an attorney for legal aid service, served as chair of the Columbia Citizens Advisory Committee for Community Development, and as a commissioner of the Columbia Housing Authority. He also is a longtime member of First Nazareth Baptist Church, and a bridge in Columbia was dedicated in his honor in 2014. Reverend Joseph Darby also is a Columbia native, and he grew up in the Willie Hill community, where he attended St. James AME Church. And St. James continues to worship now in the Willie Hill community. Reverend Darby is a graduate of Booker T. Washington High School. He attended South Carolina State University and has a bachelor's degree from the University of South Carolina. He prepared for ministry by attending Lutheran Theological Seminary. Also, he's a fourth generation minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and has worked in the Department of Public Welfare and the Department of Juvenile Justice. He has served as the first vice president of the Charleston NAACP and the South Carolina NAACP. He has been recognized by the South Carolina Black Hall of Fame and the South Carolina African American History Calendar. Currently, he is pastor of Nichols Chapel AME Church. Stuart Andrews is a partner with the Nelson Mullins Law Firm, where he's a founder and former leader of the firm's South Carolina Healthcare Group. He designed and was the first coordinator of the group's nationally recognized pro bono program. He also has been the leader of the Nelson Mullins Corporate Tax and Securities Group. Stuart received his undergraduate degree at Erskine College. After studying at the Princeton Theological Seminary, he received his law degree from the University of South Carolina. He's also the former chair of South Carolina Legal Services. As an attorney for Palmetto Legal Services, he challenged city planning and urban development policies as he represented residents of Willie Hill, Arsenal Hill, and Elmwood Park. And last but not least, Rebecca Liebson covers housing and livability for the state newspaper. She is also a Report for America Corps member, a nationwide initiative within a nonprofit news organization called the Ground Truth Project. She graduated from Stony Brook University in 2019 and has written for the New York Times, the New York Post, and NBC. Her work has been recognized by the Society of Professional Journalists, the Hearst Foundation, and the Press Club of Long Island. Rebecca joined the state in 2020. And so we are honored to have this great panel with us. They've all agreed to be honest and frank in their assessment of history and continued struggle of housing and segregation in Columbia. And at that, let's hear from our panel. And I would encourage our panel to be forthright, but also to be concise as possible to allow time at the end for the questions from our virtual audience. I want to first direct a question toward both Franchot Brown and Reverend Joe Darby. Please tell us where you lived, including where are the streets you used to play on in Columbia as a child? The people who lived there and your memories of the community. What was it like? Mr. Brown. We'll need you to unmute yourself, Mr. Brown.
Okay, now, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I apologize. First, I wanted to thank Tamika's Divine for the work she's done to help the partners to get together and to put together these sessions. Also to congratulate the greatest mayor in the United States, our mayor here in Columbia, Benjamin. We're so pleased to have him because he's not a caretaker mayor. He's an innovative man doing great things for Columbia, which is fantastic. When I was born, my family lived in Alabama Court because my family came here from Jacksonville, Florida in 1939. And believe it or not, there were very few houses in Columbia that had indoor plumbing. So we actually moved into Alabama Court because my godfather was in charge of Alabama Court. I'm just telling you the truth. And so he got us a place over there because it had indoor toilets and indoor bathrooms. But from there, we moved to Gervais Street. When we moved to Gervais Street, it was a 2-lane street. It's not the 4-lane street that we have today. It was a 2-lane street and had to be widened. And I was there doing that widening of Gervais Street, including putting back the big black library down on Gervais Street, which is now where the Masonic Temple is located, pulling our house back, and all the houses had to be pulled back to widen Gervais Street. Waverly community where I lived had the doctors and the lawyers and all of that in our neighborhood. And Waverly Elementary School is where I went to school, and Booker T. Washington High School is where I went to high school, not too far away. But Columbia was a nice, pleasant city. Christmas, we skate up and down Oak Street, and it was everybody knew everybody, and everybody welcomed everybody together as the community. That was the Waverly I grew up in. From there, I moved to Eau Claire, where I presently live, and it's ward from Ward 9 now to Ward 19, Ward 9017, I'm sorry, 709, Waverly, to, I think it's 7, to Ward 19, where I live now in Eau Claire. And of course, I've been busy in all over Columbia and South Carolina, as you very well know. That's basically my background, Warren.
Right, thank you, sir. Reverend Darby.
Yes, let me add to what Attorney Brown said and thank Mayor Benjamin and Councilwoman Devine for this opportunity. I spent the first 12 years of my life on Willie Hill, 1520 Wheat Street, which is today the address of the University of South Carolina basketball court. It was a viable, it was a stable and economically diverse community. You had teachers living next door to domestic workers, and it was a mix of owner-occupied and rental housing. Wonderful place to grow up. There were 3 churches on the hill. There was St. James African Methodist Episcopal, Antioch Baptist, Jones Memorial, which used to be called Jones Chapel, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in those days. Of those, St. James is the only one that's holding out, and now it's dwarfed by some of the houses that surround the church. Had a wonderful childhood on the hill. Played on Wheat Street, Catawba Street, Henderson Street, Rice Street, some streets that are not there anymore since they reconfigured the area. And you had what you needed on the hill. There were a couple of corner grocery stores. There was dry cleaner, beauty shops, barbershop not that far away. The schools are on Willie Hill. I attended F.C. Benson Elementary School. I attended Booker T. Washington High School. And so it was a good childhood. My mom and I lived in the home that my late father had purchased for us. And we had a lot of other family. I had at least 3 aunts and uncle and his family and a little bit more family all on the hill. So pre-urban renewal, it was a wonderful place. And it was like a lot of the communities that Attorney Brown mentioned, places that were the centers, places that set the normative behavior for those who lived in those communities, places where very often the teachers lived in the communities where they taught. So they had a vested interest in the well-being and the success of the children in that community, and related in a way that some educators no longer relate. But it was a good place where everybody looked out for each other. When we left there, we went over off of River Road near Roosevelt Village School.
Thank you, sir. And Reverend Darby, I want to ask you to continue talking on this next question, and I ask Attorney Brown to join afterward. But please tell us how urban renewal impacted your neighborhood.
Urban renewal literally gutted Willie Hill, and it was an intentional and racially tinged act. They said that they were developing where there were slums, and the slum is in the eye of the beholder. There were wonderful houses. There were houses that were historic. In Charleston, they're called Freedmen's Cottages. In Columbia, they used to be called shotgun houses, where you supposedly it was a 3, maybe 4-room house where you could shoot a gun from the front through the back door and not hit anything. And it's where some folks still have the expression of going up in the house and back in the house because of those days. But urban renewal changed all of that. I still remember when I was at F.C. Benson Elementary, coming home from school, and there was this big sign right past the railroad tracks on Pickens Street announcing an urban renewal project. And I asked my mother what that was, and she said that means white folk want the property, so they're going to take it. And that's basically what happened. They started on the farther side from Pickens Street from the University of South Carolina campus. Just left large gaping holes of vacant property in that area, came on across the other side and started going after more owner occupied, and very literally made it an untenable place to live for a lot of people. There were some folk who were owner occupied that they treated gently, including my mother and a couple of other of my kinfolk. And they decided ultimately to leave, not only because they were getting pressure, but as one of my aunts said, this is not the same hill that I knew. The people are gone, more and more people are gone, and it was a years-long process of gradually decimating a community. So it devastated that community, and it devastated in a way that has changed that community. If you go on Willie Hill today, it is an upper middle class, maybe a little bit beyond upper middle class enclave. I think with about 16 units of promised public housing. It was a place where a lot of value, a lot of culture was lost. And I mourn that value every time I go on the hill and eat at what's now a restaurant that used to be Copeland's grocery store. I remember what it used to be.
Thank you, Reverend Darby. Attorney Brown. Unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. We can hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was asking, was I supposed to see Reverend Darby on the screen when he was talking? Because I was looking at you. I thought he was supposed to come up. I'm just asking, that's all.
But
I don't know who's in.
tonight.
Say it again?
Did you hear him?
I heard it, but I didn't see him. I didn't know. I didn't know. I thought maybe when I've been on other Zooms, when the person's talking, they come up. I'm just seeing you. I'm hearing him, but I was seeing you, but I thought I was supposed to see him.
Yeah, we're not seeing him this evening. And
Okay.
I'm not as
That's
good
fine.
as he is, but hope I'll do.
Well, let's put it this way, Warren. I mean, you know, we were segregated. When we came along, we were completely segregated. Whites didn't know blacks. Whites went to white churches, went to white schools. We had white parks, black parks. We had to fight for everything we wanted in the black community. We had to fight to get us a Drew. Oh, there I go. We had to fight to get us a Drew Park, with a swimming pool. We had to fight to get a swimming pool. We had to fight to open up Valley Park, which is now Martin Luther King Park. It separated the white neighborhood to the south, I guess, from the black neighborhoods to the north. Right in the middle was Valley Park. Yet whites could use Valley Park, we couldn't use Valley Park. And if one of us ran across Valley Park, they'd chase us to the other end of the park. So there's a lot taking place in the city that we're growing up in, and needs changing completely. And we welcome change. We welcome positive change. We welcome urban renewal. But we didn't know that urban renewal was going to end up taking our valuable homes and properties and turning them into valueless homes and valueless properties, because after urban renewal came through, there was very little left. Very little money was paid to the owners of black properties in black neighborhoods. Initially, there was no relocation assistance monies paid to them. In other words, you took what they gave you and you left the best way you could to go to wherever you could go. That's how we were treated. And when we fought against 277, they were actually, developers were developing homes in the path of 277 and selling them to unknowing persons in the black community. They were selling houses they knew was only going to survive less than a year, because 277 was going to come straight through and take those houses. And those people thought they were getting a nice brand new house to live in, and they were just getting a temporary home to live in until they were approached to tell them no, that the eminent domain was going to take their property. That's the kind of thing we had to deal with all throughout the city in every different way you can think of. We had to fight everything. Nothing came to us easy. Nothing came to the Black community easy. Nothing came to us easy. Everything had to be fought for. And we had friends in the white community and the Jewish community, I admit that. And they did as much as they could, but there's a lot of social pressure placed on them as well. They couldn't do as much as sometimes their heart wanted them to do because they would be considered nigger lover or whatever you wanted to call them in those by taking up with some of our causes. So basically, that's Columbia. That's the Columbia I was raised up in, and that's the Columbia we had to change. And I welcome the change now. Like I said, I'm so happy to see Tamika Isaac Devine, who had the nerve to run for an at-large seat. I thought she was out of her mind. She ran for an at-large seat and won. And our mayor is doing such a fantastic job. I'm so proud of him. And all the members of City Council. Back to you, Warren. Warren, you need to okay, there you go. Are you unmuted?
Thank you, Attorney Brown. I want to bring in now Attorney Stuart Andrews, who, as I noted earlier, challenged city planning and early urban development policies as he represented residents of Willie Hill, Arsenal Hill, and Elmwood Park. And Attorney Andrews, I want to ask you, talk about how the communities and their advocates came together to resist these policies. What did they do? What was that like?
Well, Reverend Bolton, it was an exciting time. Actually, I was literally a month out of law school in my office on Main Street, Palmetto Legal Services, as it was known back then, and had a couple of folks show up in my office one morning and saying, we need a lawyer, and we need a good housing lawyer because the city is trying to throw us out of our homes and bring white young people from the suburbs into town and throw us out on the street without any help. And that was the beginning of my introduction to the community development grant-inspired program that the city was operating in 1978 and had been for a few years in Elmwood Park. Folks on the phone who are from Columbia area probably know Elmwood Park now and think of it as a community that's diverse and an inner city community that's relatively stable. But that was the product of an effort that was intentional by the city that targeted federal funds through the Community Development Block Grant to literally use it for folks of a different demographic than the 70 to 80% of African Americans who lived in Elmwood Park at the time. In fact, there was a city held a local community meeting, as they called it, at the first segregated First Baptist Church in the Elmwood Park area. We had one of two nuns who came down from Boston just the prior year to work in Southern communities as part of their mission. And they were the only residents of the area who were there. And during that meeting, they reported to me that the city officials invited members of the church to move into the area and to bring their friends from the suburbs and to take over these beautiful Victorian homes in downtown Elmwood Park. I began working along with other members of Palmetto Legal Services with a number of tenants and lower income homeowners who lived in the area. What we had learned is that many of those people had been there 5 or 10 years, and in fact were displaced by some of the urban renewal efforts that had already been going on for 10 and 15 years or more within the city. They had left Camp Fernance, they had left Waverly, they had left Wheeler Hill and Arsenal Hill as well, and were moving into Elmwood Park. And what we saw was a pattern of families moving and being forced to move from one low-income community with a lack of safe, decent, and affordable housing to another. these people were frankly just fed up that not only were they being asked to move from their homes, but the city money was being used as an inducement for folks to come in to renovate their homes at low interest and loans, or sometimes grants that would be used to put people on the street with no relocation assistance. And so I began getting to know these folks, and we had community meetings, people, some of whom were getting eviction notices. Others were fearful that they were. But when I got involved, there were roughly 300 housing units in Elmwood Park, and half of them had already turned over in the first 2 years. There were construction crews and for sale signs on every block. Many of their neighbors had already been displaced, and the ones who remained were prepared to try to do something about it. So as we got to know each other, we started meetings. We actually held press conferences on the porches of some of the homes in the neighborhood. First effort at an organized public presentation was at the city's advisory council meeting. And we learned that the advisory committee for the community development block grant did not have a single person who was a resident of a community that where the funds were being directed from the community development program. And we were warned about quoting and citing federal regulations at that meeting. The federal program was intended by Congress to primarily be used for the benefit of low and moderate income people. And those were not the people who were benefiting from this program. And in fact, the City of Columbia's own application to the HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, acknowledged that only 10% of the rehab loans and grants were being directed to lower income families. Another illustration of the fact that the city knew very well what the effects of its programs were is that nearly 250 families were identified as those being displaced, but nearly 200 of those were lower income minority families that were identified in the city's application. And yet they were persuaded that that this effect was inevitable and it was the best interest of the cities. So ultimately, when it didn't work to meet with the advisory council, our clients, the members of the community, took to the streets. Back in the 70s, it was still fashionable to march on City Hall, and that we did with signs and placards, and had a press conference at the steps of City Hall, attended a city council meeting, and that began the communications where members of city council began to take us seriously. Mayor Kirk Finley and members of the council, particularly Rudy Barnes, were solicitous to us and said there's plenty of housing and funds to support the programs, but the actual directors of the community development block grant programs were not as responsive. So we filed a complaint with HUD and objected to the $2.5 million annual allocation of federal funds that go to the city without appropriate relocation assistance, alternative housing that was set aside for the use of landlords, protection for tenants so they could remain in place, and the development and assistance to get into alternative housing. Public housing, as both I know Franchot and Joe are aware, was really unavailable. 2,000 folks on the waiting list. The city had a vacancy rate of less than 1%. And so there just were no places for these folks to go. And yet the purpose of the program that was recognized was to use federal funds to incentivize private renewal, gentrification, as it's generally known, of not only Elmwood Park but other areas of the city. But yet the city at the same time said, well, it's private development. We can't control it, and we can't do anything beyond our program to assist tenants. So it was a very unsatisfactory process. Ultimately, HUD did require the city to provide relocation assistance in the form of prohibiting displacement that was a direct impact of loans or grants. The problem was that so much of the displacement had already occurred, and it was actually being affected largely by the private market that was responding to the investment of federal and city funds already. So that's largely what we did in Elmwood Park. I've probably taken up too much time, but lawsuits and other federal administrative complaints were we filed concerning Wheeler Hill and Arsenal Hill as well.
I want to thank you for sharing that, Attorney Andrews, and want to get Attorney Brown or Reverend Darby. You all want to jump in here and share a little bit about what the communities and advocates did to resist these policies?
Well, I joined in Reverend Darby. I recall going up to Wheeler Hill, standing in the driveway of Fannie Phelps Adams, who lived on Wheeler Hill and was the assistant principal for many, many years at Booker T. Washington High School. In fact, she walked from her home on Catawba Street to Booker T. Washington on good days and actually walked to work. But I recall having a press conference in her driveway about this group that was coming through acting as though they were an official state agency. It was the South Carolina Development, whatever, I can't recall the name of it, but they acted as though they were state authorized and exercising eminent domain to purchase the properties, these properties off of Wheeler Hill. And a lot of people really thought they had official authority to do this. They had government money, but using it to allow a masquerade to take place where private developers were really purchasing this property. As you can see now, and Reverend Darby can further, more in depth explain how the property, the big houses sitting on Wheeler Hill now were not there during our day. And they were only put there because this group came along and pretended as though they had the legal, lawful authority to purchase these properties and purchase them and turn them over to private industry or private development. And that happened not only on Wheeler Hill, but many other places as well. Wheeler Hill is a real class example of that. The fraud, it was actually a fraud against the people. And I stood up there and fought against it. And of course, I don't know what we accomplished, but we at least brought some insight to this problem that was taking place. And of course, we exposed them, and I think it's probably slowed it down from continuing because it sort of stopped after a while. I request Reverend Darby to join me on this because I know he was up there at the time.
Yeah, well, I was in the 6th grade back then, so I wasn't that great an advocate. But that experience and the Book of Washington experience, there are a couple of things that shaped me into the loudmouth, annoying preacher that I am today, particularly Booker T. Washington. For those who didn't grow up in the community, Booker T. Washington High School was a strong school, first Black school, if not in the Midlands in the state. It was the first school to be officially accredited, Black or white, by the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. Strong school, good graduates, wonderful reputation. But in 1972, there was a school board elected under the banner, I'm sure Attorney Brown remembers it, Deadline 72. And their expressed desire was to slow down desegregation as much as they could. A part of that also was doing away with solid Black schools so that those solid Black schools would not have new white students. And they closed Booker T. Washington in 1974. I was one of those who fought hard to stop that from happening, but that fell on deaf ears because it was a different time. The city council did not look like Tamika Isaac Devine. And at that time, it was a totally different group. And that group was just determined that they were going to take Booker Washington, and they did. And they simply completed a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a school is near a thriving community and you gut the thriving community, you can justify closure by saying, even though students came from all over the area, all over the Columbia area, to say, well, the community near the school is no longer there, so we can sell this to the University of South Carolina too. And they, made some very nice statements that were nothing but statements. They engaged in what I've learned to call Black mitigation over the years, that we're gonna do what we wanna do with this Black community, but we'll find some nice crumbs to give you, and we'll sing kumbaya and everything will be all right. And it's not all right.
Right, period.
Yeah. Reverend Bolton, let me just add a little bit, if I could, to the Wheeler Hill experience. In the late 70s, early 80s, I represented.
Mr. Dave.
Hello?
Right here, we can hear you.
Yeah, good. Sorry. 9 families from Wheeler Hill. And it was right at the end. And to build on what Attorney Brown said, it's the Carolina Research and Development Foundation, a private nonprofit organization that was functioning as an agent of the University of South Carolina, was acquiring properties and did that. And Franchot, I'm sure that's what you were referring to throughout the.
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah, throughout Wheeler Hill, and was invested not a dime in these properties that they held for 10 or 15 years. So they became a slumlord, essentially, and held the property, collecting rent, and then ultimately forced folks out with 30 days notice, and then tore down their homes. And one after another, that's the way that the final housing was destroyed. I got involved there, probably long after Reverend Darby left. But it was the families who were the last remnants of the community on Wheeler Hill, and the Public Housing Authority, in kind of an effort to atone for the cities and for the universities, particularly pretty damnable management of that community, put up 16 units of public housing, and which didn't begin to account for the hundreds of families, of course, that were evicted and whose homes were destroyed in the 60s and through the 70s.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Rebecca, you've come to Columbia and the state newspaper and jump right in and covering housing and livability. Let me ask you, what do you think have been some of the lasting impact of these sort of policies?
Right. So, I mean, what we've seen unfold in Columbia has happened across the country, whereas in the past, wealthier families wanted to settle down further outside of the city centers. Now everyone wants to live near downtown. And so what we saw, what Mr. Brown and Mr. Andrews are describing happening in neighborhoods like Arsenal Hill and Wheeler Hill and Elmwood Park, that's starting to unfold in other neighborhoods as well. So it's spilling over into places like Waverly, Edisto Court, even Arthurtown. And I guess the big question is, where are the people that are getting displaced going? And so a lot of them are being pushed further and further to the outskirts of the city because no one wants to live on the outskirts anymore. Everyone wants to live in the inner city, I guess. So think of the developments we see over by Two Notch Road and Broad River Road in North Main. Think of those apartments. Many of them are in horrendous shape, and there's all sorts of potential safety violations there. They're not well maintained by their landlords. And on top of that, they're also far from public transportation and other important resources like groceries, city services, and healthcare. So that's been one impact. One important change I think that's taken place over time is who is moving into these gentrifying neighborhoods. Whereas the displacement that Mr. Brown and Mr. Darby were trying to fight against was largely driven by these middle-class white families who were attracted by government urban renewal programs. Now, students are a big driver of gentrification. As we see more and more students coming to the city to attend the University of South Carolina, landlords are taking notice that there's a demand there, and they realize that students are willing to pay a much higher premium than a lot of other families that are traditionally from these neighborhoods. And students also don't care as much about the conditions in their apartment. So they're an easy market to target. Another important point I think that a lot of people I've spoken to have expressed is that it seems like investment in neighborhoods only occurs once gentrification starts to take root. So whereas people can spend years trying to get roads paved or streetlights added or attract small businesses to the area, people say that that only happens once the original residents are moved out. And so for neighborhoods in the city that do still have large minority populations that have not yet been the target of gentrification, residents are facing all sorts of disparities because of that lack of investment. So for instance, there was a study published earlier this year from a Washington think tank, and it basically analyzed different health data in formerly redlined neighborhoods across the country. And one of the things that they found in Columbia is that residents who were living in historically Black neighborhoods, they had much higher rates of certain chronic diseases like asthma and high blood pressure, hypertension. And this was much more prevalent in areas like Waverly or Celia Saxon than in places like Rosewood or Wales Garden. One thing that I found really shocking was that in one section of the city that they studied, which included parts of Celia Saxon and Edgewood and Booker T. Washington, life expectancy was actually 12 years lower than the national average. So this lack of investment is literally shortening people's lives. So all of this is to just say that a lot of people want to see change in historically Black neighborhoods. They just want to make sure it's being done in a way that benefits the people who are from there, and that the neighborhood doesn't just improve once the original residents are already forced out.
Thank you. Does either of the other panelists have anything to add to that in terms of the lasting impact of these policies?
Oh, yes, I definitely do.
Yes, sir.
The lasting impact for Willie Hill was a total change in Willie Hill, and the cooperation that Stuart and Attorney Brown referred to is the heart of that. At some point in time, Carolina decided they were not going to develop on the far side, and they staged a large and elaborate ceremony on the front of St. James AME Church to say that they were going to make it a neighborhood again, that that development group. And they made a point of saying that anybody could move back, but that they would give special preference to folks who left the Hill and who wanted to come back to the Hill. And that was celebrated until the land prices were announced. And the land prices were more than a modest home that most folks could afford at that time. And so it was like, if you got the money, you can do it. So the result is you got a Wheeler Hill that doesn't look like the Wheeler Hill I knew. You got a Wheeler Hill full of very large McMansion-sized houses. And you have the lingering hypocrisy of 16, as I said, affordable housing units, and that promise that was just basically an unfulfilled promise. But that's caused too, particularly for those of us who grew up on Wheeler Hill, is not a lot of goodwill with the University of South Carolina in some respects. And I say that as a Carolina graduate. I also know that 4 years before, about 6 years before I graduated, if you were Black, you could not walk across the fraternity quad if you crossed the campus. You had to stay on the streets. You remember that, Warren? You get kicked off the campus. And so that combined with the Wheeler Hill, combined with Booker Washington, I spent 2 years at State. I got my degree, bachelor's undergrad degree from Carolina. But for a long time, I don't do it as much anymore because they've tried to make amends in some areas. But for a long time, if someone would ask me where I got my degree, I would say, I'm a graduate of the University of South Carolina, but I'm an alumnus of South Carolina State University.
All right, thank you, sir. Well, let me ask you, Rebecca, let me ask you, as you consider this history and look around the country today, are we able to identify cities who are making strides in creating affordable housing and preserving endangered neighborhoods? I mean, who's getting this right?
Yeah, so I think it's a really difficult question because this is something that a lot of people are just starting to wake up to now and acknowledge. And oftentimes by the time people are willing to go out of their way to do something, it's almost too late to fix the problem. The damage has been done. But there are some places that are being more proactive. I wrote last year a story about the city of Newark in New Jersey, which for years struggled to get any type of investment in the city. It was, Newark was given this reputation as a dangerous place, as a bad place where people didn't want to move. And now that there's so many areas close to Newark that are being gentrified, a lot more people are spilling over into Newark and moving into the city. And now they're having to grapple with their own gentrification problem. And so one of the things that the city is doing there, and something that's been proposed as a solution elsewhere, is this idea called inclusionary zoning. And so basically, inclusionary zoning means whenever there's any sort of new development in a city, especially in traditionally Black neighborhoods, the city is putting in guidelines to make sure that a certain percentage of that new development has to be dedicated to affordable housing. One other thing that I know Newark is doing is also on top of that is making sure that a certain percentage of the construction that takes place in this area, a portion of those contracts have to go to minority-owned contractors to make sure that money is going back into the Black community.
Warren, might I add something?
Yes.
Going back down to the Coliseum that was built in a Black neighborhood, and Stuart, I think that's your area. The churches, remember, where 2 or 3 churches had to be relocated. All of the houses relocated, businesses relocated, the whole works, just to put the Coliseum down there. They picked the lowest, they picked all the Black neighborhoods to put the most undesirable services. They put the water and sewage plant down in the area where Black folks live. They also put the jail down in the Black neighborhood off of Bluff Road. I mean, all that's Black down there. So they find the cheapest, they lower the value of property in the Black neighborhood so it's easier and cheaper to buy those properties and use them for undesirable state services, because no other white neighborhood would put up with it. So they have no choice but to dump them in on us because we don't have the ability to fight them. We didn't have we couldn't fight back. We were helpless. We were totally at their mercy coming along as in Columbia. We didn't have anybody that would look after us. So we had nobody we could go to really, really stand up for us and fight for us and join in on our cause. Everything we got, we had to fight for. I want to make that very clear. And when you get a president like Donald Trump, he will try his best, and he has already tried his best and done a great job of turning the clock back on us. Those 3 Supreme Court justices he placed, 3 justices he placed, those conservative justices he placed on the Supreme Court are going to be there to hold us back for as long as they sit on the bench, unless they ever make a change of heart. We can't depend on that. So, I mean, all across the country, all across the Columbia and South Carolina and the whole United States, from Nashville, Tennessee to Washington, D.C., all the Southeast redeveloped. And they used the fires after Dr. King died to renovate all of up 14th Street in Washington, D.C. All that's completely new. You will never recognize it. That was an opportunity to get them to come back and to engage in gentrification of all that area. So a lot of D.C. is new. Now, what happened, Stuart, to the Blacks that live there? Where are they? Where are they? Who in the hell gave a damn? We got what we wanted. We paid them a little bit of money. They're gone. They're out of our way. Now we can move on. That's where it's been done all over the United States, all over. And Columbia is just another example.
Amen. That's exactly right. Yeah, Warren, let me just mention this to give folks a sense of this. If you think of the inner city of Columbia, the business district, as being the heart of the city, and that's debatable. The areas to the north, which is Elmwood Park and Irwood, to the west, which is now the Vista and the riverfront in Arsenal Hill area, and to the south, which includes where the university is, was Wheeler Hill. All of those in the 50s and 60s were Black communities, and few of them remain in that way. And those neighborhoods were systematically and intentionally destroyed through the use, largely, as the color of law says, through a plan to segregate and eliminate the communities that were in the way of the city's plans to develop.
If I could add on to that, Warren,
Yes.
and so it doesn't sound like I'm just beating up on Carolina. I live in Charleston now, and there's a ways for Charleston to go as well, and it typifies and it says it is just not a Columbia problem. When I came to Charleston, it was about 20 years ago, a little more than. They nicknamed it the Holy City because of the preponderance of church steeples. Now you have more construction cranes than church steeples in Charleston skies because development is just running amok. And Charleston has talked about setting aside for affordable housing, especially since it's so badly gentrified. When I came here, I had people living within walking distance of the church. That's not the case anymore because it costs too much to live on the peninsula and in other parts of the city. It's good to do set-asides, but at some point in time, governments have to look at policies that require ethical behavior by developers. I have folks in the church, some of whom live in the neighborhood that's gentrifying. Hardly a day goes by when they don't get a call from somebody saying, will you sell us your home? Please sell us your home, because the neighborhood is changing and as homes are renovated and as property taxes go up, the present residents can't afford those. And so they move to North Charleston, they move to Goose Creek, and it makes Charleston less of what Charleston used to be. So it's not just a Charleston thing. We have to go beyond just doing, as I said, trying to do something like they're fixing to do in Mount Pleasant, where they're gonna expand the 2-lane road to a 5-lane road through a community that goes back to Reconstruction, Black community, to convenience the new community that was built within the last 20 years. That's not a good thing.
I want to thank you all so much for joining us this evening. It's just been such an enriching conversation thus far. I want to shift a little bit now. I know we have a good bit of questions from our virtual audience, and we want to take an opportunity to hear some of those questions from some of those who joined us this evening. And so I'd ask Jennifer, how are we going to do this? You want to read the questions for us?
Sure. I'm Jennifer. I work for the Center for Civil Rights History and Research, and I'm just going to read some of the questions we've gotten in the Q&A box. And as a reminder, if you have a question to address to the panel, at the bottom of your screen, there's a box that says Q&A. You can enter your question in that section. We have quite a few questions, so I'm going to combine some of them. We've had a couple of questions about some of the new development that's going on at the Bull Street campus. So one from Kevin Patton: the city has committed many resources to the development of the Bull Street district. Has there been any commitment from developers to incorporate any inclusive housing in this large urban development? If anybody knows that.
Warren, I can jump in there. So the state, when the state sold the Bull Street property to the private developer, there were not any agreements put in place. However, because there is a significant amount of investment that was requested from the city of Columbia, when Bull Street development started, we actually did enter into an agreement with the developer based on some of the investments that the city would make for infrastructure. So there are some agreements regarding making sure that there's workforce housing. Also, there are some agreements regarding the creation of jobs and minorities being part of that development. A great opportunity for us, the Bull Street, on Bull Street, there is the baseball stadium, and that is owned by the city of Columbia. So that, because we had more control over that, there was a significant amount of minority contractors that weren't just, and I won't say just, but subs on that deal, but we're actually partners. We're development partners on that stadium. And so those are the types of things that I think need to happen more. Quite honestly, I would acknowledge that I think there's probably more that could have been done in that development agreement with the Bull Street developer. And I think that lessons learned from that is some of the things that Rebecca mentioned, that what some other cities are doing as far as community benefit agreements and other things. I think those are some things that we need to think about moving forward. But there is some participation, to answer the question, there is some participation, especially as it relates to workforce housing that will be developed. But because it's a private developer, the city was a little bit limited on what we could mandate because we are not jointly developing that. If we do some zoning, inclusionary zoning and some things, it won't matter if the city is doing an investment, we can probably have some of that authority. So that is something hopefully will come out of this discussion.
Thank you, Councilwoman Devine. What's our next question?
Okay, another one that I'm combining from a few different people, but it's about other Columbia neighborhoods. So how can we prevent the same results we saw from the gentrification of Wheeler Hill and other historically Black communities in Columbia from happening in Gonzalez Gardens and in Allen Benedict Court? Are there any measures that we can use to ensure that goals of economic equity will be ensured?
Lauren, all our neighborhoods need to be organized. Every neighborhood needs to be organized. Organized with members of that community meeting. They should not shun young people. We have a tendency to push them to the side. It's not fair. You've got to include all of your neighborhood, all of the pieces and parcels of your neighborhood together. You need to organize and you need to meet regularly, share what's going on in your neighborhood, protect your neighborhood, make it better, not allow others to come in and make it worse. Do what you need to do to make sure that you maintain the values of your properties and keep your communities as a safe, decent, and sanitary place in which to live and enjoy and work and play and whatever you want to do. That's the biggest thing we need to do, is to make sure that we're on top of things in our own neighborhoods. Please do that and you'll solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, I want to jump on that answer as well. I think being organized is a great way to try and make sure that you're seeing the type of development you want. I know that some cities, residents in some cities have organized what's called community benefits agreements. And this is basically a contract between a developer and a community group. And basically it gives the community more say in what the developer will build, and it sort of holds the developer accountable. I know that this has happened in Denver, certain developments over there. So there are ways for the community to sort of step up to the plate and try and hold the developer's feet to the fire.
What I'd like to add to that is to suggest that if the city has not already created a structure to that would support the organization of discrete communities, that it should do that. Every community organization needs the kind of resources that the city could help provide without directing them in any regard. And it would be a resource that would more than pay for itself by communities being enabled to take responsibility for their own futures, and not only as it relates to city programs, but as Rebecca said, to organize with private developers as well. I think it's real important that with the thoughtful leadership that we now have in the city, that's different than what it was 40 years ago, that the city recognizes that small investments in communities can result in major private development. And there needs to be a recognition that when the cities do make investments in communities, that's likely to generate, if successful, private investment, that the cities then need to take responsibility for the nature of that development and provide protections and set asides for housing that's affordable for low and moderate income people.
And might I add that in our neighborhoods, we need to include all the churches, all the principals, the administrators of our neighborhood schools. In other words, we need to take the whole neighborhood geographically, look at it, all of the entities inside that neighborhood, and pull them into a meeting, organization, so that we can all keep up with what's going on. And we can head off a lot of problems that way, Stuart. A lot of problems can be diverted if they're caught in time. Like you can have an impact on, like my church, First Nazareth, when we built our new church, we put into the contract with the general contractor. He had to have 40% minorities. He had to do that if you wanted to keep our contract. If you do that, you're getting somewhere. You can hire people in your neighborhood. You can make sure that they have a job and they're qualified for jobs. But if you don't do that, he's going to build, he's going to bring his people, and you're stuck. You end up with a building, but you had no participation in that building and no money was earned by your neighbors and your friends from that building. You just ended up with a building. But if you had input, you can make sure that contractor specifies that he's going to hire 40% or give you the authority to hire some particular people, then you can get somewhere and you can make your neighborhood a better neighborhood.
Thank you, Attorney Brown. What's our next question, Jennifer?
We have a question from Allard Alston. Attorney Brown, I think you mentioned this briefly, but can you talk a little bit more about the battle over I-277 and the lasting impact of its route? You're muted, Mr. Brown.
We felt initially that 77, or well, that's the Northeast corridor, was being routed through the Black neighborhoods. I mean, let's face it. I mean, these are engineers at the highway department. They can send this so many different ways, but instead it was directed at us, straight through the Black neighborhood. We even looked at the map, and we could show where they could either go another way on some existing streets and not tear up the neighborhood, our neighborhood, like they were getting ready to do. So, I mean, we really, really, really caught the devil with that. But the end product is, as I mentioned to you, the properties, people's houses were, the land that the people's houses sat on were sliced down to very little left for them to enjoy it. They didn't take the house. They took so much until it lowered the value tremendously to their house once the highway was built. I mean, just like I mentioned, the actual construction of those houses and the path of the doggone Northeastern Freeway was just deceitful and underhanded and just as low level as you could possibly get to people looking forward to owning their house for the first time in their life, and they get it. And within a year, they've got to move because the highway is being built, and the contractor knew all the time that highway was coming, and they didn't know it. But I see you up, Reverend Joe.
Yeah.
You
Well, I'd echo much of what's been said. I think the important part is community involvement. And I think the government has to be proactive in that. Very often when changes are made, whether it's housing, whether it's road communication infrastructure, whatever agency is spearheading that will simply announce that there's going to be a public meeting. And those who are most able to make public meetings are those who don't have to worry about childcare, who have the adequate transportation to get to the public meeting, who don't have other things on their agendas. I think that governmental entities need to be a little bit proactive, as Attorney Brown said, about going to the community, about finding ways and means to get the community involved, a broad spectrum of the community, so that when plans are made, it will not be a matter of, this is what we have planned for your community, isn't it wonderful? It will be more a matter of, this is what we're thinking about. Let's sit down and talk this through.
Amen.
So the next question, I think, maybe speaks a little bit to that. Cassandra Elliott, I have currently moved back into my family home in Washington Park off Shop Road. My family lost our home to USC due to eminent domain many years ago on Bull Street. Now it appears that USC is encroaching down Shop and Bluff roads. We have small communities, poor representation for our areas, and soon we'll be dealing with the widening of Shop Road. What can we do?
Can I speak to that? I
Yes,
think
sir.
I just repeat to my home girl, hello, Cassandra, that what I just said is it's important that communities get involved. I mentioned the road that's going through Mount Pleasant. One of the reasons that that's still an unsettled matter is that you had the very affluent, overwhelmingly white new communities get involved, but you also had some people of goodwill in those communities who met with the leadership of the Black community that would be affected. And together they raised sand. And it's that raising sand that's made county council put the brakes on that down here and take more of a look. And I think that you need to do that kind of thing and be proactive about it and look down the road too. I'm glad you mentioned that area. I remember when I was still in Columbia, people were rejoicing because water and sewer, dependable water and sewer, finally were going to be coming down to Bluff Road, to Arthurtown, to Taylor's, Little Camden. But I said then, be careful what you pray for, because with the dependable water and sewage comes the opportunity for new development that might change property values and that might change the character of your communities. And the Bluff Road corridor is a very different corridor than it was just 20 years ago now because of that infrastructure.
Attorney Andrews and Rebecca, do you have anything to add to that that question about what should they do? Thank you, Reverend Darby.
I think Joe hit it right, which is the need to organize. And the only thing I would add to that is part of that organization is take advantage of the single member districts, both for the city and the county. They're individual members of city council and county council who run for office in that district. And after the community gets organized, develops its voice, they should, among the first things they should do is begin to communicate with their public officials about what their expectations are and how they need to be protected.
Thank you. What's our next question, Jeff?
Okay, we've gotten a number of questions on sort of how do you repair the damage done. So I'm combining like about 7 or 8 different questions on this. So one of them, for example, is I think representative of a lot of these questions is from Todd Shaw. Thank you very much for telling your powerful stories about how race and racism operated to undermine Black communities in Columbia and elsewhere. How is it possible to repair the damage done? Is it possible to repair the damage done from segregation, urban renewal, and gentrification? Another one of the questions references some of the resolutions passed by the City Council in Asheville. Jason Darby asked about Asheville as a possible model. So if the panel can speak to how do you repair damage done?
I'll let somebody answer Jason Darby's question.
Maybe Tamika Isaac Devine might speak to that. I don't know. That sounds like something she might be able to address. Stuart, I don't know, can you address that?
Well, my thoughts are that in the same way that Richland County Council is beginning to explore affordable housing policies, that the city needs to do that as well. And rather than do that separately, I believe that the Columbia City Council and Richland County Council should undertake a joint plan to develop a citizen-informed plan with regard to affordable housing that will begin to address. It's not the only element by any means of it, but it'll begin to address the chronic shortage of housing that exists within the city. As Rebecca pointed out, for 40 years, there has been a movement pushing lower income minority members of the greater Columbia area out to the burbs, where there's no where the jobs don't exist in the same degree, and where there's little or no effective public transportation. And so there needs to be within the city the development of affordable housing opportunities. And we need to, the second element of that plan would be to identify potential areas of gentrification and displacement so that the city and county can get ahead of the curve rather than responding after the fact when it's often too late.
I think
One thing that I've seen happen on a smaller scale in other places, although this is more of a band-aid than a larger fix to the problem, is there are a lot of nonprofit developers who are building affordable housing in now gentrified areas, and they're giving preference to people who originally lived in the neighborhood. So if you apply to live in one of these low-income units in these developments and you're born in that neighborhood or you were forced to leave, they're helping those people to come back. And I know that in Edisto Court, which has not totally been gentrified yet, there is a nonprofit sort of mixed income development going up there, and the developer has pledged that they want to make an effort to help people who had to move from Edisto Court for various reasons come back there and take space in these units for people with who are living at like 80% AMI or who need more affordable housing.
I think that whether it be education, housing, economic sector, whatever, also you can identify an aggrieved community or areas of that community, look at ways and means to do that. You know, Georgetown University established the fact that their forebears at the school were enslavers and that they had sold some slaves to keep the school alive. One of the steps that they took was to identify descendants and to offer scholarships to those descendants. When you can identify descendants, if you're talking about housing, there's an established group of folk who live on Willie Hill. They're still in Columbia, I believe, a Ward 1 association that covers that area down around Assembly and Blossom Street that used to be housing. When you can identify an aggrieved group or their heirs, then you can look at ways and means to cure that.
Thank you. Before we go to the next question, Jennifer, let me ask now, we've primarily identified residents and the government as being key to responding to this, but who else should be at that table helping bring some remedy in addressing this issue?
Faith community, people of goodwill in the private sector, and I underline people of goodwill in the private sector. Community leadership, traditional organizations that do housing and that do civil rights, like the NAACP, and some non-traditional organizations too, since organizations like the NAACP can get a little dusty if we're not careful. I think you bring folks who also are speaking up in their active voices today so that you can get new ideas and you don't keep recycling the same things and getting the same answers.
Thank you. Our next question.
Sorry, I was muted again. So let me see. Sorry, let me just pull out this. We've had a few questions on efforts to commemorate and sort of preserve the memory of some communities that are affected by urban renewal. So a question from Melissa DeVelvis and McConan Campbell about that. Do we know what are efforts in various communities around Columbia to sort of preserve the history of communities that have been affected by these policies?
Jennifer, I can jump in a little bit, and I think Reverend Darby mentioned the Ward 1 organization. So Ward 1, again, is the area, actually my grandfather grew up in Ward 1, that is now where the Darla Moore School of Business and the Colonial Life Arena are, and that community has been completely displaced. but the Ward 1 residents and descendants of that area have come together, and they have a reunion every year, and they have preserved their history. I know Dr. Bobby Donaldson has helped them a lot with the history there. So that's a great model that some of these other communities can do. I know University of South Carolina, because of what happened with Booker T. Washington High School, they have attempted to do some preservation of the story of Booker T. Washington High School and things, and that is in that area. And I know Dr. Donaldson, who is on here as well, he is looking at doing some reflections and talking to people who are in these have been in these communities and were in these communities, and record their stories and preserve them for history. So I don't want to take his thunder on there, but I will tell some folks who might be listening and are descendants of people in some of these areas that we've talked about that have been affected by urban renewal in the city of Columbia, or if you know someone who might be older and actually lived through this, like some of our great panelists, certainly connect them with Dr. Donaldson, because he will be doing some reflections, and hopefully, you know, as the many things I hope to come out of this, hopefully the city can partner with Dr. Donaldson and others to have a repository for these reflections, so that we never forget this history, and we can honor these great neighborhoods and communities in the way that they should be.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Jennifer, can we get one more question? I know it's getting close to time for us to wrap up.
Yeah, we have one more question. So going back to the question about, you know, how do we repair this work? We talked a lot about the city and policies, but does USC, the University of South Carolina, or even the city, of reparations to the residents of Ward 1 and Wheeler Hill and some of these other neighborhoods?
What are your thoughts, Reverend Darby and Attorney Brown?
You would hit me with that one, huh? I think that Carolina would do well. And, you know, I've given Carolina a hard time tonight, and some of that's deserved, but they have taken some steps. They did renovate Booker T. Washington Auditorium. They looked at doing some other things. Dr. Donaldson has done an excellent job at Carolina in making sure that the school is responsible. I think it would be nice if, in accordance with what Dr. Donaldson is doing, if there would be some kind of a group, and it might already be in existence, that meets quarterly and talks about ways and means to do that, so that you could have folks not just responding to a question, but sitting down and coming up with a comprehensive way to do that, something similar to what the Councilwoman talked about with Carolina, and maybe with some other entities in Columbia as well, to preserve that story with those who have a vested interest and still are around to have a vivid memory of that history.
Thank you, sir. Attorney Brown, do you want to address that at all?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I served on the Community Relations Council for the City of Columbia when Leona Plow was in charge of that program. And it did do a fine job of keeping up with the neighborhoods and trying its best to help the neighborhoods develop in a way in which would be advantageous to that neighborhood and to keep it strong and powerful. So we do have the community, I assume they still have the Community Relations Council in operation today, but I served on it many years ago. Like I said, Leona Plow was our head of that at that time.
All right, thank you, sir.
But you know, once a building is built, you really can't tear it down. I mean, once a building is there, it's there.
Yeah.
You want to fight a building in your neighborhood, you better fight it before they start. Once the building is there, it's there. So
let me, Warren, if I could just make one comment that's a bit off the question, but I'd like to plant a seed, which is, as Congress undertakes the process of considering the development of a plan for reparations for formerly enslaved people, I think that we would want members of our congressional delegation to encourage to include on that agenda the impacts of urban renewal, and particularly the impacts of federally funded urban renewal, of which substantially affected and caused the displacement of Black communities and individuals within Columbia. And I hope that those conversations will begin and will be taken seriously. And federal urban renewal funds have had a devastating effect, as the color of law indicates, on our country, not in isolation, but they've certainly enabled a good bit of it. And that should be incorporated into any conversation about reparations, as the mayor acknowledged in his opening remarks.
Thank you, Attorney Andrews. And I want to thank each of the panelists for joining us tonight. Attorney Franchot Brown, Attorney Stuart Andrews, Reverend Joe Darby, and Rebecca Liebson. And just before I want to get ready to turn this back over to Councilwoman Tamika Isaac Devine, just before we do, sitting here listening to Reverend Darby and also Attorney Brown, and I hear the passion that you all have, and just wanted to ask y'all to take a minute or two and riff for us for a minute, dream a little bit, and tell us what could have been if the effort was made to preserve these communities and give them what they needed to survive, rather than take people's property away and that sort of thing. What could have been?
If I could easily answer that, I could write a book and retire. But I think what could have been was a different attitude to the community. We had the opportunity, particularly in the 60s, when the civil rights legislation was fresh and new, when there was the kind of passion you see in a post-George Floyd moment to do some things that were concrete and not just conversational. And that lasted for the moment before we fell back. America has a habit of making a good step and then falling back, as we have in the last 4 years. I think that if we can build on the relationships we have, not wait until things are on fire, acknowledge what's been in the past, and then acknowledge ways that we can maintain positive things in the future, then we can effect positive change.
Warren, let me I don't know if I can speak to that issue as well as I'd like to in a limited time, but I'd like to recommend to absolutely everybody on the panel, as well as everybody who's joining in, listening and viewing us today, about the ETV program that I turned on. I set it up to tape it. I'm glad I did. It's called Driving While Black. I don't know if any of you have already seen it, but I can assure you it is worthwhile for each and every one of you to see it. It's a 2-hour long program with no commercials. So get your popcorn and your Kool-Aid, unless you want to pause it, and listen to it and it takes you back to the slave ships right up to today. Very little is left out. It had me remembering things I had forgotten, things that I had participated in, right into that program. Nationwide, things were happening all over the country that were happening right here in Columbia, and it gave me a chance to look at all of that. So it's called Driving While Black. It sounds like a simple little name, but it uses the car to show you how the car has traveled through our histories right up to today. And you will not regret looking at that program called Driving While Black on ETV. So I urge everybody to take a look at it. And I'd like to conclude with those statements.
Thank you, sir. And let me again thank everyone in our virtual audience for joining us tonight. And we're certainly grateful for you taking the time to learn more about this vitally important topic. And we're especially honored by this distinguished panel. And I know they could talk for hours. We don't have the hours tonight, but you all have enriched us. You all have taught us. And I think that you've created a thirst for more in some people. So I hope people will continue to learn more about Columbia and some of the memories you shared and the history of housing in the Columbia area. And this is just the beginning of this series. There's much more to come. It's certainly been my pleasure to be a part tonight. And we will now conclude with some closing remarks from Councilwoman Tamika Isaac Devine.
Thank you so very much, Reverend Bolton, and thank you for being our moderator for this evening for this very powerful discussion. I couldn't think of anybody else who could kick us off for this series but you, and I appreciate you so much. I also want to echo and give my thanks to our esteemed panel, to Reverend Darby, to Attorney Brown, Attorney Andrews, and Ms. Liebson. You guys did not disappoint. I had very high expectations for this evening, and my expectations were exceeded. This has been an amazing conversation, and like I said at the very beginning, this is just the beginning. I know that there are a lot more questions that we didn't get to. There are a lot more that we can delve into these topics, and we will do that over the next month and a half. But even after the next month and a half, it goes to what Reverend Darby just said is, then what? We will not have a conversation and then it just stops. We have to act. We have to make some changes, and we have to understand where we came from in order to preserve our present and make sure that we have a future that is equitable. So I thank you guys so much. Just a couple things in closing. I want to thank our partners. This was an idea that I got after I read this amazing book, but I could not pull this together and do it justice. And so we reached out, and I'm so grateful for the partners who joined on and say, yes, this is an important conversation and we want to be part of it. So I want to thank our partners, Richland Library, Historic Columbia, Columbia SC 63, Dominion Energy Charitable Foundation, SC Humanities, the Center for Civil Rights and History and Research, African American Studies Program at the University of South Carolina, and the Institute for African American Research at the University of South Carolina. Without these partners, we would not be able to have brought you this series. And so I thank you all so much. And then I have to thank our organizing committee that brought you these amazing panelists and the future ones that we'll have, and really kind of came up with a framework for this discussion. And so for that committee, I have to thank Melanie Huggins and Tamara King at Richland Library, of course, Robin Waits at Historic Columbia, Dr. Bobby Donaldson, who we mentioned earlier this evening, Columbia SC 63, Jennifer Melton, who you all have seen and has helped us tremendously with the technology and getting everything else together, Dr. Todd Shaw with the University of South Carolina, and former City Councilwoman Ann Sinclair. You guys have been amazing, and all of your staff and support. I don't have everyone's name, but this is a team effort, and everyone who has worked for partner organizations and worked with our organizing committee has been tremendous to be able to bring us this. Just a couple notes. Reverend Bolton mentioned this is just the first of several. And if you guys go back to the city website at columbiasc.gov, you can see the dates for the upcoming panels. And I believe Ms. Waits can put them up here, but January 7th will be our next session. And in that session, we're going to talk about the effects of redlining. It was alluded to this evening, but the effects that of these policies we are experienced today with health disparities. And Ms. Liebson mentioned the study that was done previously about health disparities and life expectancy based on redlining. But we know we have educational disparities. We have economic disparities. I know there was a question in the chat about the wealth gap and investment. And so we will talk about all those things in our second session on January 7th. We have another amazing esteemed panel. So I ask you to please go and make sure you put that on your calendar and join us again, and share it with your friends and your neighbors and your community members to be part of that conversation on January 7th. And then lastly, I just want to mention, Ms. Liebson mentioned about sometimes when people find out or realize the history, it's too late to do anything about it. And we certainly don't want to be there. I think it's been a long time since these policies were put into place. And so it will not be solved and addressed overnight, but we can never believe it's too late to do anything about the negative effects of these policies. And so the City of Columbia, I think the mayor and his amazing leadership and the other members of Columbia City Council, you have a unanimous council bounded together to make sure that we're addressing these issues. And so earlier this year, the city commissioned an affordable housing task force, Attorney Andrews. So we do actually have one, and we are working with the county. Actually, County Councilwoman Allison Terratio is the liaison and serves on our task force. But we got an amazing task force that we've been meeting since June. And likely next year, we'll be making some recommendations to the mayor and city council regarding what we can do as far as affordable housing. We are also currently undertaking an equity and inclusion survey. And the link will be up here at the end. And so if you've not taken that survey, that will be up through December 31st. So we're asking people to participate in that equity and inclusion survey so we can hear from you as our citizens about the city and what you believe we're doing as far as equity and inclusion, and so that we can make sure that we are taking into account your concerns and your questions and even your ideas on how we can be a more equitable, inclusive, progressive city. And so with that said, I want to again thank you guys for joining us. Encourage you to always reach out to me, the mayor, and other members of city council on any ideas or questions that you have regarding what we're going to be doing. But this conversation will be the kicking off point to, I think, some great changes and suggestions and policy recommendations that will be brought forward to the city as we move forward. So thank you for being here. You guys have a great night. Have a wonderful holiday, safe season. Continue to wear your mask, I have to say that, and continue to be engaged with us in this conversation, because the only way we're going to make the changes that need to be made is if we do what this panel talked about, and it be a collective community conversation and we move forward together. So good night. Thank you so much, and God bless.